The following lecture will be on The Stranger, chapters 1 through 3. So we're going to dive into the text, we're going to look at some quotations, we're going to look at some characters, and we're going to ask ourselves some questions about the reading. So I recommend that you have already read this section, so chapters 1 through 3, before you watch this lecture. Because there will be some spoilers and there might be some things that you don't understand if you have not read the text. All right, let's start. So chapter 1. Let's start by looking at the characters, which is especially important in chapter 1 because we are meeting many of the characters for the first time. So we talked briefly in the introduction. If you haven't watched the introduction, go watch that first. We talked about Merceau, who he is. He's our protagonist. On Course Hero, it calls him an atheist and a nihilist. So that means that he doesn't believe in God and that he doesn't believe that there is any meaning to the world. The meaning of life is nothingness. He's alienated, he's isolated, he is estranged from other people and society. We also meet Maman, although we don't really meet her because she is dead. Her death impels the action of the story. She is the inciting incident, you could say. And she can be said to represent social value that's placed on motherhood, among many other things, but people clearly think that mothers are important, both in this culture and our culture and most cultures. And so there is this societal belief that mothers are to be put on a pedestal. And that causes some problems for Merceau later on because his relationship with his mother is not one of putting her on a pedestal exactly. We also meet Celeste, who is the owner of a cafe where Merceau eats lunch all the time. Celeste remains loyal to Merceau later in the book, and he's loyal to him throughout the book. He later will testify that Merceau is honest and decent, and that bad luck leads him down the path that he follows. So he has similar beliefs of sort of chance and perhaps some nihilism, as Merceau does. We also have Thomas Perez, and I apologize if there are any accents on some of the words. Some of them got lost when I was either copying the text or typing it out, so just a note on that. Perez is Merceau's mother's late in life lover. They met at the home for elderly people, and they fell in love towards the end of her life. And he and Merceau's mother were so close that people joked about them being fiancés. It says here that Perez's relationship with Madame Merceau is one of the few genuine emotional attachments that the novel depicts. Perez, as someone who expresses his love for Madame Merceau, serves as the foil to the indifferent narrator. So he is like Merceau's opposite. He's emotional, he's deeply attached to the people in his life. He lives through the lens of emotion and connection rather than like physical feeling and logic. We also have the caretaker. He works at the old person's home where Merceau's mother spent the 3 years prior to her death. And during the vigil, when they're watching over his mother's body, The caretaker chats with Meursault. They drink coffee, smoke cigarettes next to the coffin. And these gestures later weigh heavily against Meursault as evidence of his monstrous indifference to his mother's death. So he seems like a minor character, but he ends up being a very important character later in the story. We also have the director. So he manages the old person's home. And he speaks to Meursault, assures him he shouldn't feel guilty for having sent his mother there. However, he also implies that Meursault has perhaps done something wrong in sending his mother away. And when Meursault goes on trial, the director becomes clearly judgmental and puts Meursault's actions in a negative light. Okay, so I'm going to give little tiny overviews of what happens in the chapters so that you can remember where we are. They're going to be very brief, not like a summary that you would find online, but just like a little reminder. So in chapter 1, Meursault finds out his mother has died. He goes to the senior care home where she's been living to keep vigil and attend to her funeral. And he feels out of place there. He keeps apologizing, perhaps unnecessarily. The famous line, "Maman died today," or "Mother died today." And there has been some controversy over which translation is more correct. Should it be "Mama"? Should it be "Mother"? This is the opening of the book. He says, "Maman died today," or "Was it yesterday?" He can't seem to remember. And this really shows us who Meursault is as a person. He knows that his mother has died. He can't quite place it. He's maybe not concerned with reflecting in terms of time or in terms of his own relation to others. He's kind of just in the moment and trying to make sense of this swirling world around him. The more you know. Did you know that Camus summed up The Stranger in one sentence? In fact, he wrote, "In our society, any man who doesn't cry at his mother's funeral is liable to be condemned to death." Later, he clarified that he simply meant that his protagonist refuses to lie regarding his emotions, which leads to his demise. So that's quite a radical statement to say that if you don't have the right emotional response to a situation, then our society is willing to kill you. But perhaps as we keep reading, we might find that there's some truth in this. That you have to show the proper emotions, otherwise you will be ostracized and perhaps, in the most extreme circumstances, condemned to death. Let's look at some quotations. Page 3. "I asked my boss for 2 days off, and there was no way he was going to refuse me with an excuse like that. But he wasn't too happy about it. I even said, 'It's not my fault.' He didn't say anything. Then I thought, I shouldn't have said that." So, over and over again, especially in the beginning of this book, we're going to see Meursault feel uncomfortable with the way that he interacts with other people. He's going to apologize a lot for things that perhaps aren't his fault. And when we spoke about this in class, if you were in class with me and talking about this, some of you gave some wonderful suggestions about why a character might do this. So perhaps he has experienced other people not understanding him in the past. Perhaps he's done some things that would make him at fault, and so he feels truthfully guilty. Perhaps since he is an outsider, perhaps he assumes that other people won't understand him, and so he feels like he has to apologize in order to get through the world. Relating to the point that I just made a moment ago, or that rather Camus made many moments ago, if you don't play along in a society that has certain sets of beliefs and morals, then you're going to get crushed. And so perhaps Meursault subconsciously knows this, that he needs to apologize because he doesn't really fit in. At another point concerning the caretaker, he says, "I thought he was criticizing me for something and I started to explain, but he cut me off. You don't have to justify yourself, my dear boy." That's on page 4. And then also concerning the residents, so his mother's friends who are there to keep vigil with him. "For a second, I had the ridiculous feeling that they were there to judge me." So either these are founded in reality, so perhaps the caretaker and the mother's friends are judging him and he's picking up on that, or perhaps he's had previous experiences that make him feel as though people are going to judge him, and so that's his gut reaction to situations. Let's look at a quote from page 6. "Just then, the caretaker came in behind me. He must have been running. He stuttered a little. We put the cover on, but I'm supposed to unscrew the casket so you can see her. He was moving toward the casket when I stopped him. He said, 'You don't want to?' I answered, 'No.' He was quiet, and I was embarrassed because it felt I shouldn't have said that." So here in real time, we see Meursault make a choice that is true to him. He doesn't want to see his mother's body, and I'm sure you could think of a whole list of reasons why that might be. But he realizes midway through saying he doesn't want to see the body that the caretaker may judge him for that. He might think, oh, he doesn't love his mother. Oh, he doesn't care to see the body. Oh, this guy must have no emotions. Oh, this guy is cold. This guy's evil. Any number of judgments. And so here, perhaps this is founded in some reality of judgment, that he feels embarrassed. He realizes that this is not something that he's supposed to say or feel. And then here's a quote from, I believe, the caretaker. He says, "One last thing, it seems your mother often expressed to her friends her desire for a religious burial." So at the end of her life, Maman says that she wants a religious burial. And Meursault says he thanks the man, but while not an atheist, Maman had never in her life given a thought to religion. So students have interpreted this as either Meursault having a limited relationship with his mother, so perhaps he doesn't know his mother very well, or perhaps his mother didn't speak about religion with Meursault because she knew that he was an atheist and that he would not relate to it. Or finally, students always say, well, perhaps she wasn't religious, but she's at the end of her life and now she's scared. And so the pressures of being afraid of death are causing her to become suddenly religious. And all of these are possibilities, but they are important to consider because they shape the characters and the world that they live in. Now here is an important part that seems unimportant, but it's so important. Meursault says, "Then I felt like having a smoke." He's in the room with his mother's body in the casket. "But I hesitated because I didn't know if I could do it with Maman right there. I thought about it. It didn't matter. I offered the caretaker a cigarette and we smoked." So Meursault feels the need to have a cigarette. He's addicted to cigarettes, as all smokers are, and at any moment he might feel that urge. It's like being thirsty, right? He stops for a second because he thinks, oh gosh, my mother's body is right in front of me. Perhaps he thinks He's thinking of social responsibilities, of respect. Perhaps he's thinking about how his mother would have felt about him smoking. He's probably got all of these possibilities going through his head. He thinks about it, and then he realizes that it doesn't matter. After all, to him, not much truly matters. There is no real morality. But also, his mother's dead. She's not going to know that he's smoking in front of him. He doesn't think that it's a particularly wild thing to do. It's not like he's dancing on the casket. So he decides he's going to smoke, that it's not really a big deal, even if it seems as though it might be socially unacceptable. So he offers the caretaker a cigarette, and they smoke together. Remember this moment. And here's from the funeral. Now, funerals are supposed to feel a certain way. They're supposed to be bittersweet, full of love and remembrance. Perhaps they'll be on a rainy day and everyone's crying like it's a movie, right? There's just this gloom over the day. There's this sadness. But this is not the way that things work in this book. Instead, it says this: the procession seemed to me to be moving a little faster. All around me, there was still the same glowing countryside hooded with sunlight. The glare from the sky was unbearable. So the people who are walking with the body are going faster and faster. It's like he can't keep up, and it's super, super hot outside. There's this glare, this sun glaring on him. Not very bittersweet, not very traditionally gloomy and funereal. Instead, sort of itchy and irritating, and like you can't keep up, and everything's swirling around you, and it's going too fast. This is his experience. So this speaks to the absurd, the meaninglessness that Camus is trying to express. It also speaks to sort of expectation versus reality, what we think that a funeral should be as a society, and what it's actually like to go to an event like this. Perhaps you're wearing a suit that you never wear, and it's itchy or uncomfortable. Perhaps there's a baby crying in the background when it's supposed to be a very solemn moment. These things happen, and Camus would point to the absurd, to meaninglessness, as the reason behind these types of experiences. So now we've hit the end of chapter 1. We're going to look at some questions and concepts to consider. First of all, what would cause a person like Meursault to apologize all the time? And I spoke to this, but perhaps you can think of a few other reasons, or do your own little layman's psychoanalysis on the character. Is Meursault's behavior odd? Is it inappropriate? So is he really acting in a strange way, or are we seeing inner workings of the mind that we just normally don't see? Perhaps you can relate to some of Meursault's experiences, or perhaps you're thinking, gosh, this guy is so weird, I don't understand him at all. I'd like you to notice the seemingly authentic love between Maman and Thomas Perez, because it is different from other romances in the book. Notice the messy and unromantic qualities of the funeral, as I was just talking about. The heat, the running, the lack of belonging on behalf of Maman's loved ones. So remember that Perez and Meursault are both trying to catch up with the coffin. Perez runs so much that he's crying and sweating, and it just keeps moving on without him. And then also, I'd like you to ask yourself, how is Meursault already an outsider or a stranger in the very first chapter? How do we already know that he is like this? Okay. And then let's go on to chapter 2. Quotations. So there aren't any new characters in chapter 2, so we're going to go straight to the quotes. Oh, there are new characters. What happened there? Oh, that's my bad. There are some characters. We have Marie. She is lively, she's fun-loving, she's emotionally vulnerable, and she wants to marry Meursault. Rather different. Perhaps opposites do attract. She is an example of someone with very conventional feelings. Like, she has these dreams of marriage, dreams of love. She values companionship and loyalty and marriage and things that her society also values. Our overview. Meursault meets Marie at the beach. We see where he lives, and we get a glimpse of his everyday life. All right, I'm thinking that my quotations and my questions and concept slides got mixed up, so that's what happened there. So we're going to look at quotations. I had a hard time getting up because I was tired from the day before. This is the first line in chapter 2, which is after Meursault gets home from the funeral. He is a master of understatement here, although for him it's not an understatement, it's just the truth. He had a big day the day before. It was the day that he went to go to his mother's funeral. And he is not talking about how he feels. He has apparently no emotions. He simply is tired from the day before. And here's a little section that, again, has an impact later. He's just met Marie, and he says, she laughed again and told me there was a Fernandel movie she'd like to see. And by the way, Fernandel made comedies. Once we were dressed, she seemed very surprised to see I was wearing a black tie, and she asked me if I was in mourning. I told her Maman had died. She wanted to know how long ago, so I said yesterday. She gave a little start, but didn't say anything. So she's surprised. She's like, whoa, you're romancing me on the beach and you want to go see a movie? Strange, I can't believe this just happened. And then he says, I felt like telling her it wasn't my fault, but I stopped myself because I remembered that I'd already said that to my boss. It didn't mean anything. Besides, you always feel a little guilty. So it's interesting how he goes from the first person, I, to the second person, you. Besides, you always feel a little guilty. Because it's almost like he's trying to universalize his experience there. He's trying to make it feel like everybody tends to feel a little guilty when they go through a death. And that's quite an assumption on his part. That might be one of the few moments in the book where he assumes something about everybody. Because really, he's the one who's feeling guilty. But he does say it didn't mean anything. So he decides not to say that he is, that it's not his fault that she's dead. Because in the long run, it's a meaningless sentiment that he feels this way. But it's interesting because he tries to make it as though everyone would feel a little bit guilty for their situation with their mother and the death, when really it's a personal thing to him. So he kind of depersonalizes his emotions in the one moment where he does feel an emotion, that guilt. Then we get a little scene where he is looking out over the neighborhood. His apartment overlooks his neighborhood. And it says, my room looks out over the main street in the neighborhood. It was a beautiful afternoon. He's watching the families walk. And I wrote here, outsider mode, activated, because he is not out there with all of the people walking. He's not out there with a family. He is on the outside, quite literally, looking in to this town. And he does this all the time because his room overlooks the street. Now we get to something that's going to be repeated throughout, which is a quote about Meursault's sensual nature. So when we talk about sensuality here, we're not just talking about like, oh, Meursault has he's so sexy, he's so into the sensual stuff. That's part of it, but it's really more to do with feelings of the senses. So not like emotional feelings, but relating to or involving gratification of the senses. So like physical pleasure. So he says, I wanted to smoke a cigarette at the window, but the air was getting colder and I felt a little chilled. Meursault over and over again is going to make decisions based on the way his body feels and the things that he desires in terms of hunger, in terms of temperature, in terms of cigarette addiction, all these things that have to do with his body. And that might be the one place where we could question his free will, because he's responding to his own body's impulses. And sometimes it causes him to make, well, often it causes him to make decisions. So I want to know, how much does sensuality impact your own life or actions? You can ask yourself that. You know, am I governed by my thirst, by my hunger, by my physical needs, or not so much? And then, do you think it's better to act on emotion, or physical sensation, or logic, or maybe authority, what people say is best? So you could think about, you know, hunger, because everyone gets hungry. Is it best to eat when you are feeling really happy or feeling really sad, responding to those kinds of emotional eating urges? Is it best to eat when you feel really, really hungry? Is it best to eat when it makes sense to eat? So perhaps you've put some sort of timeline together, or you are counting the number of macronutrients that you need, so you eat based on that. Well, it's 8 o'clock, and that's when it's supposed to be time to eat. That's what I've decided, so that's when I will eat. Or maybe you have heard from doctors that it is best to eat 4 meals a day. And so you're going to go by the doctor's authority, or maybe your mother's authority. Your mother says, oh, you can't have snacks between meals. It's going to ruin your appetite. You must eat 3 meals a day, so that's how you'll eat. You can apply that to other acts and actions that you partake in. How long should a person mourn? We're bringing this back from the Hamlet days. You know, what is appropriate for mourning? Is it wrong to fall in love or have fun while you're supposed to be mourning someone, or while you are mourning someone? What do you think about that? Another concept found in this chapter is the idea of meaninglessness. So where in this chapter can you find examples of things not meaning anything in the long run? Or perhaps you'll see that when you're going through some of the questions above. And then finally, what is the role of the person who is an outsider or an observer? What do they contribute to society, or what do they do that is significant, even though they're not in the midst of everything else? Okay, one more chapter and this lecture is complete. Chapter 3. Let's see if I've got the order right here. So overview, that seems right. So in chapter 3, Meursault goes to work, he eats at Céleste's, and then goes home. We meet Salamano and Raymond, Meursault's neighbors. Meursault does a favor for Raymond. Okay. And they're the characters. We have Meursault's boss. So he is Meursault's supervisor. He gets annoyed when Meursault takes 4 days off for his mother's funeral. But then he's really kind to Meursault. He asks about his mother. And he eventually offers Meursault an opportunity to move to Paris, basically a promotion. But Meursault angers him when he refuses, and the boss is stunned by his lack of ambition. Salamano. And I took this from Shmoop because I thought that they said it better than I could have said it. You know you're reading a bleak book when the most likable male character is a dude who abuses his dog. Salamano is likable in some ways. He's emotional and complex. He's a curmudgeonly old man who uh, lives with his old disease-infected dog in Merceau's apartment complex. He's the only character in the book who has a complex yet easily understandable and genuine relationship, but it's with a dog. So it's not with a human being. He's kind of grumpy. He curses and yanks at his dog and spits at his dog. And he never really shows his true feelings for the dog until it disappears. Raymond is the catalyst to the stranger's plot. So Raymond beats and abuses his mistress, and he comes into conflict with her brother, who is an Arab. Raymond draws Merceau into that conflict with the Arab, and so he's going to be a very important character. He's another foil for Merceau, because he is a clearly immoral person, while Merceau is simply amoral. He lacks morality. So Raymond acts in ways that are clearly sinister and definitely the opposite of what society wants. And Merceau is kind of just accidentally enacting those things because he doesn't believe in morality. All right, let's look at the quotes. So, another example of sensuality. Merceau loves to wash his hands before leaving the office to go to lunch. And he talks about how he likes it better in the morning because in the evening the roller towel is soaked through, and one towel has to last all day, so it feels much better earlier in the day. So that's a little detail on page 25 that's an example of Merceau's sensuality. This is talking to Celeste on page 26. He asked me if things were all right now. I told him yes, they were, and said I was hungry. Again, the sensuality. I ate fast and had some coffee. Then I went home and slept for a while because I had drunk too much wine, and when I woke up, I felt like having a smoke. So this shows a couple things. Again, that sensual nature of Merceau, and also the way that Celeste and Merceau kind of have the same worldview. Celeste is like, are you okay now? And he's like, yep, I'm fine. And then he eats and they kind of just go about their day. They're not going to try and talk out all of the emotions of his mother's death. He knows that that's not the way that Merceau functions. And again, Merceau acts on his physical needs, on what he wants, not that he goes home because he's supposed to boil potatoes, but he wants to boil some potatoes. And here we have a quote about Salamano. I'm not going to read the entire quotation to you, but I'm going to give you a moment to look at it. The very last line, they look as if they belong to the same species and yet they hate each other, definitely speaks to the absurd. Like, it seems like these two should be the best of friends, which in some ways they are, but it's not necessarily meaningful that they look alike. They still have a complex relationship. This talks about the routine, that twice a day at 11 and 6, the old man takes the dog out for a walk. And they're used to it. They haven't changed their route in 8 years. They're in this rhythm. And it's a rhythm of abuse as well. So the dog pulls the old man, and then he beats the dog and swears at it. The dog cowers, and then when he forgets about it, they do it all again. It's the same thing every day. All right, so now we meet Raymond. Just then, my other neighbor came in. The word around the neighborhood is that he lives off women. So that means that he is essentially what we would call a pimp. He is using the work of women prostitutes to make money. He's setting up prostitutes with customers. But he won't admit that. So when you ask him what he does, he says he's a warehouse guard. Generally speaking, he's not very popular, but he often talks to me and sometimes stops by my place for a minute because I listen to him. I find what he has to say interesting. So clearly, and perhaps this is to be expected at this point, Meursault does not judge Raymond for his lifestyle. He just finds it interesting. So this is sort of a emotion-free, intellectual interest in this person. He likes listening to him talk. So Raymond talks about this situation with a woman. It says he asked if I thought she was cheating on him, and it seemed to me she was. If I thought she should be punished and what I would do in his place, and I said, you can't ever be sure, but I understood his wanting to punish her. So Meursault is able to understand why Raymond feels the way he does, but he refuses to give any sort of moral proclamation in the situation. He says, you can't ever be sure. And this is, the great existentialist dilemma and the cause of so much angst, is that because there's no meaning, you can't know what the right thing to do is. Should someone be punished? Should someone not be punished? Is it wrong to cheat on someone? We don't know all of the ins and outs of their relationship. And so Meursault gives him a very intellectual, existentialist answer. Now, one more thing, note that Meursault is not thinking about the well-being of Raymond or of his mistress. So he's not trying to say something that will keep her safe or, do any sort of benefit to the couple. He's simply thinking intellectually, which is the nature of his character. And his relationship with Raymond is the same way. In a very sort of creepy, gangstery way, Raymond's like, we're friends, right? After Meursault does him a favor. And Meursault's reflection is, I didn't mind being his pal, and he seemed set on it. So he's kind of non-committal, kind of, sure, whatever, we can be friends. It's not a wholehearted, emotional connection. It's simply, this guy wants to be my friend, so sure, I'll say that we're pals. Why not? And here we have our final questions and concepts for part 1 of part 1, chapters 1 through 3. The absurd is huge here. And in fact, I went back to Schmoop because they gave a great little analysis of the absurd in this section, which is that Camus further develops the theme of meaninglessness, of the meaningless life, by showing how people have the tendency to impose meaning on events. Raymond interprets Meursault's behavior as having a meaning, as showing Meursault's sympathy toward him, that it does not. So, similarly, Raymond views Meursault as a close friend, yet theirs is a relationship that is meaningless to Meursault. Dramatic irony occurs because the reader is aware that Raymond's assumptions are totally wrong. So we know that Meursault doesn't care about this friendship, but Raymond thinks, oh, this guy really likes me, we're real buddies now that he's helped me out, he must really care about me and my situation, and the audience knows that's not true, but that's how he acts. We can also think about morality versus amorality. So, what do we believe about the morals of these situations? What would we think is right? What does society think is right? Is there a universal morality? Or do we align more with Marceau in that we think that there is no right way to do things and that we have to decide based on our own choices? And finally, relationships and the idea of settling for the familiar. Later, Salamano will say that he got used to his dog like he got used to his wife. It wasn't any sort of special love, but it was something that he was used to. So that's something to consider. How do people sometimes settle? And do you think that that is what existentialists would call living in bad faith, doing something that's not based on choice, not based on what you want, but is based on something else? Perhaps you're settling into the inertia of living. And also you can consider like what makes a good relationship, a friendship, or a romantic relationship to you. Do both people have to feel the same way? Can it be some sort of exchange that's, maybe not emotional, or are emotions always involved? So those are some big, big questions to ask yourself and to ask about the novel. All right, that ends lecture 2. Thank you for joining me on this journey. I hope that it was helpful as usual, and I will see you for the conclusion of part 1, chapters 4 through 6, soon. Have a wonderful day.